I have been talking a lot recently about the huge losses Ukraine has suffered during their Kherson and Kharkov offensives, huge losses that even the Western media has admitted to, and also the fact that the Western media, other Western analysts, they have admitted that Ukraine is using mostly equipment transferred over to them by the West, and this is because the large amount of equipment they started out with in late February has been destroyed. We also see the West running low on the type of equipment they can send to Ukraine that is practical. And so now they are starting to talk about the impractical. Much of Eastern Europe, who had been part of the Soviet Union during the Cold War and then have since joined the EU and NATO. They had a large amount of Soviet military equipment, including T-72 main battle tanks. They transferred most of those to Ukraine, and a lot of those T-72 tanks were used during the Kherson and Kharkov offensives, and they lost huge numbers of these, many if not most of them. What are they going to use to replace these T-72s? There are no more T-72s in Eastern Europe in the numbers that Ukraine requires. So now Ukraine is asking the West for Western main battle tanks. And more specifically, the German Leopard 2, and also there have been some talk of the Abrams, the M1 Abrams tank. This is the US main battle tank, of which there have been several versions, the M1A1, the M1A2, and then multiple versions of that. And the same goes for the Leopard 2. They have been constantly upgraded over the years. Western main battle tanks are drastically different than Soviet era and now Russian designed and built main battle tanks. It is a completely different philosophy. If you look at them in terms of size comparison, you can see how much smaller Russian and before that Soviet era tanks are compared to their Western counterparts. And this is because they thought the smaller you make it, the lower to the ground you make it, the harder it will be to hit, the less of a target you are presenting, while the West, on the other hand, was piling on armor and weaponry and just adding on the weight, a huge amount of weight. The weight difference is many tons. There's a couple of other differences that I'm going to get into here in a moment. But I just wanted to go over this because it's in the news again. So I came across this Politico article not too long ago. These are not rental cars. As Ukraine pleads for tanks, the West holds back. This is not a lack of will. This is rooted in realities in sending these weapons to Ukraine. It is just completely impractical. So the Political article says, Ukraine is asking urgently for modern tanks to help their forces seize on rapid gains in the northeast and take additional territory, but the West is dragging its feet, according to 7 people with knowledge of the matter. The tanks have shot to the top of Kiev's wish list as Ukraine presses its gains in the eastern Donbas region amid the shocking Russian collapse this month. The request took on new urgency this week after Vladimir Putin announced that he would mobilize 300,000 additional troops for the fight in Ukraine, a major escalation of the campaign. Well, if you're in the middle of an offensive and you're asking for a completely different weapon system you have never used before, something as complicated and involved as a main battle tank, it will never be ready in time to help you exploit whatever gains you think you just made in Kharkov. That is a fact. I have said many times before, it takes 6 months minimum to train an entry-level tank operator for the M1 Abrams or the Leopard 2, and then you have to remember it is a tank crew. There are multiple members of a tank crew that have to work together, work and train together in order to be effective on the battlefield. Ukraine does not have time for that. And even if these tanks were to show up with Western operators in them, you still have to create the logistical back end to support them, sustain them on the battlefield. And we're going to get into all of that here in just a moment. The article continues. It says, the more modern American-made M1 Abrams and German-made Leopard tanks would add a powerful punch that could help Kiev's forces capture and hold more ground compared to the old Soviet-era tanks they currently operate, say experts and Ukrainian advisors. But top national security officials in both countries have hesitated to provide the tanks, in part due to the training and logistics challenges involved, according to U.S. officials, Ukrainian advisors, and congressional aides. And this is something that I've been saying for months, that people have called me a Putin propagandist over. This is now the Western media admitting these realities. The article goes on. Western-style tanks would provide a major upgrade to Kiev's armored force in terms of range, speed, and fire control, allowing Ukrainian forces to hit a Russian target up to 1.5 miles away and move before the enemy can shoot back, said retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, a former commander of U.S. Army Europe. But the truth is, maybe Ukraine lacks these capabilities with their tank force, but Russia does not. They have modern fire control systems, thermal imaging sights on their tanks. And I don't know if people remember, but there was this story about the super sniper Wally from Canada, and he actually left Ukraine after a Russian tank killed half of his team with the first shot from over 2 kilometers away, just to give you an idea of what Russian tanks are capable of on a battlefield. The Politico article starts to talk about some of the shortfalls of using Western main battle tanks. It says, these are not rental cars. There's a lot that goes with it, Hodges said. You are basically adding hundreds of additional things that would have to be carried along. You look at a U.S. Army tank company today, there are thousands of gallons of fuel following behind them every day. So let's look at some of the numbers in terms of fuel and how that affects sustainment on the battlefield. Now, remember, these are just ballpark numbers. Again, there are many different versions of all of these tanks, but they're ballpark numbers, and no matter which way you cut the numbers, you're still going to draw the same conclusion. So let's just use some basic numbers. The M1 Abrams, the fuel capacity is usually 1,900 liters, and that gets it about 150 to 200 kilometers off-road, or up to 426 kilometers across roads. The Leopard 2 carries 1,200 liters, and that'll get it between 220 to 340 kilometers. Now the T-72, is also a tank that has been around for a long time, but constantly upgraded within the Russian army. It also has 1,200 liters, and you can add on additional fuel with these drums that you will see actually attached to the outside of the tank, and it could go between 460 to 700 kilometers, the latter number when you're using the fuel drums. So the T-72 is using less fuel, goes further, and it does better in terms of fuel consumption than both the M1 Abrams and the Leopard 2. And the T-90, the most recent Russian tank that you'll find on the battlefield, of course, is the Armata T-14. That is a totally different story. The T-90 actually performs even better. Now, the reason why the M1 Abrams is way off the charts in terms of fuel consumption is because it uses a turbine. It does not have a diesel engine like the Leopard 2 and the T-72, T-90, and many other main battle tanks. They decided to go with a turbine. The turbine is more powerful, so you get more horsepower, you get better performance on the battlefield in terms of mobility, but it comes at the price of massive fuel consumption. Now, the Leopard 2 has a diesel engine, but it still performs poorly in terms of fuel consumption versus the T-72 or the T-90 because it just weighs much more than either tank. And then when you're talking about the M1 Abrams and it using a turbine engine, you also have to remember that in addition to the fuel consumption issue and the added burden that will place on your logistical system, it's a turbine. It requires a totally different approach to maintenance and repairs. You need a completely different type of mechanic and technician to deal with it. Now, speaking of maintenance and repairs, this is already a major issue for Ukraine. A lot of the equipment that Ukraine is using now has been transferred to them from the West. It is equipment they have not previously used. They do not have a large pool of manpower trained to maintain and repair it. So what are they doing with it? They are shipping it out of the country, because if you set up a maintenance facility inside Ukraine, Russia is going to shoot missiles at it. So they have to ship it all the way to the border, mostly in Poland. So if you are in the Kharkov region or the Donbas region, fighting Russian forces, fighting local militias, your tank breaks down, your artillery piece stops working, you have to send it about 1,000 kilometers to the Polish border. It has to get fixed, and then you have to send it 1,000 kilometers back to get back into the battle. That is very cumbersome, to say the least. And there's even an article about this. It comes to us from DW, German state media, Ukraine war, how to repair the Ukrainian army's modern weapons. And it says, 7 months after the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, repairing worn-out Western weapons is becoming increasingly important. The workshop for doing so is to be built on the Polish-Ukrainian border. So they're doing improvised maintenance in the probably existing facilities in Poland. They're going to build a whole new center for doing this, but how long does it take to build a center and get it operating and running? And then even when it does, again, it is still 1,000 kilometers away from the front lines. The article also claims intensive fighting means weapons are worn out. Spare parts for various Western weapon systems need to be kept at the ready, as close to the Ukrainian border as possible. Wolfgang Richter from the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, which advises the federal government in Berlin, told DW. Secondly, you need trained personnel who are capable of repairing Western weapon systems. It is a difficult endeavor because so many different weapons have been delivered to Ukraine. I think about the different artillery systems as well as necessary peripheral equipment of French, Italian, British, US, and German design, said Richter. The military equipment from many countries needs completely different spare parts and in large quantities. So they're describing a multitude of major problems that Russia simply does not have. They have their own equipment that they make in their own factories, equipment that they have used for years. Even the more recent equipment has been developed from older systems, so there's continuity there, and they have a large pool of manpower trained to maintain and repair it. They're just rolling it right across the border into the Donbas region, into Kherson, into Zaporozhye. And this is not an issue for Russia. When something breaks, they have maintenance facilities very close to the front line. And even if they have to send it back further, it's going into Russia with Russian technicians to fix it and send it right back. Another consideration to keep in mind when we're talking about main battle tanks is, again, training. For Soviet-era tanks and now Russian main battle tanks, there are 3 crew members. You have a commander, you have a gunner, and you have a driver. For both the M1 Abrams and the Leopard 2, you have 4 crew members. You also need a loader in addition to a commander, a gunner, and a driver, which means a whole new skill set that you need to train Ukrainians on, and then they all have to train together to be effective on the battlefield. Again, this is something else to keep in mind. Now, in terms of protection, despite all of this extra weight, many tons more than the T-72 or the T-90, they are just as easily defeated with modern-day anti-tank guided missiles as anything else that we've seen on the battlefield. And I've gone over this article many times, so I'm not going to read through it, but I will show it to you. The national interest. Turkey's Leopard 2 tanks are getting crushed in Syria. Not so good armor after all. And they are talking about how many Leopard 2 tanks operated by Turkey, and these are tanks that were bought from Germany. Turkish troops trained on them. They integrated them in due time into their military. And then when they were sent into Syria, they were getting wiped out. They were getting wiped out by ISIS and also Kurdish militants. And they were getting wiped out by anti-tank guided missiles, improvised explosive devices, IEDs, and a couple of other means. So that's the German Leopard 2. If Kurdish militants and ISIS militants with the type of anti-tank missiles they can get their hands on can destroy these tanks so easily, what do you think Russian forces are going to do? They have many, many times more missiles. Their own tanks are quite capable of knocking out another tank. They have all of these capabilities that can also be used with their military aviation. Their attack helicopters launch anti-tank guided missiles. What do you think is going to happen when these Leopard 2s go into Ukraine? The exact same thing, but just much faster and more efficiently in terms of being destroyed. What about the M1 Abrams? Let's say for some reason the US ends up sending M1 Abrams. Are they going to fare any better? Well, look at this article from Defense One. And there's many other articles out there about this topic if you search for it. Saudi losses in Yemen war exposed by U.S. tank deal. And it says the U.S. State Department and Pentagon okayed a $1.2 billion sale of 153 Abrams tanks to Saudi Arabia. But that's not the real news. Turns out 20 of those tanks, made in America by General Dynamics Land Systems, are battle damage replacements for Saudi tanks lost in combat. Even though the formal announcement of the sales does not say where the tanks were fighting, the Saudi military is believed to have lost some of its 400 plus Abrams tanks in Yemen, where it is fighting Iranian-backed Houthi separatists. Now, again, these are fierce fighters. They're highly experienced, very aggressive in defending their country, but they are not a professional standing army like Russia. They have nowhere near the type of equipment available to them that Russia does, and yet they are still able to knock out these M1 Abrams tanks the US sold to Saudi Arabia. Again, so it's something to keep in mind. This myth that somehow Western main battle tanks are invincible or better protected than their Soviet and Russian counterparts, it is just that, a myth. And where did this myth come from? This myth came from US fighting in both of its wars of aggression against Iraq, Desert Storm in the 1990s, and then the 2003 invasion. They were going up against antiquated Iraqi tank forces who were poorly trained, poorly equipped. Their tanks did not have modern fire control systems and sights. And so they were just knocked out one after the other by American armored forces. Iraqi forces did not have a significant amount of anti-tank guided missiles. That is not the case. Not in Syria, not in Yemen, probably not in Iraq anymore, and not in Lebanon. Ask Israel during their 2006 incursion into southern Lebanon. Hezbollah forces were using modern anti-tank missiles, and they knocked out this Merkava tank, supposed to be one of the best in the world. Did not help them in that case. And so it's definitely not going to be the case in Ukraine today that these tanks are going to enjoy some type of mythical invincibility on the battlefield going up against Russian forces. So once again, this is an example of Ukraine asking the West for weapons, not because they are more effective or more appropriate, but because it's the only thing that they have left. This is the only thing they think they could conceivably get their hands on. And it is something that even if the West did decide to finally give Ukraine, it is not going to make any difference. And it is going to be much harder to put these tanks on the battlefield, even if they are manned by Western troops trained on them. It's still going to be incredibly difficult to get them to the front line and sustain them on the battlefield. The fact of the matter is, even with a Western trained tank crew, an anti-tank guided missile is an anti-tank guided missile. It is going to go through the armor. It does not matter who is sitting inside. So Let's just keep an eye on this story as it develops. Let's see just how critical Ukraine's tank shortage actually is. We know they lost a lot of tanks during the Kherson and Kharkov offensive. How much more do they have left? And seriously, what are they going to do next once they're out of these Soviet-era tanks? Just something to really keep an eye on. It is one of these factors that is ultimately going to contribute to how this conflict concludes. If you thought this was interesting, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps my channel grow. If you're watching this on YouTube, please check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. I'm on Telegram. I update my timeline several times a day. I have all of these YouTube videos automatically backed up on Rumble and Odyssey. It might take a day or two, but they will show up eventually. Closed captions will also show up eventually. It could take a day or more, but they will eventually show up. Thank you for your patience. In the video description below will be all of the links to these articles I referenced, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube videos. If you see an advertisement pop up, please feel free to click through it, skip it. It is not doing me any good. If you want to support my work, you can do that through Buy Me a Coffee, through Patreon, and also PayPal. To everyone who has been helping out month to month, or through one-time donations, or even by just sharing my work with other people. I could not do this work without that support, so thank you very much. And as always, thank you for watching.